Oh, okay, well, we'll get started. Yeah. All right, well, before we start, I just want to tell you, I got some cool I've been memorizing scriptures the last few weeks, and it's been a lot of fun. And I try to memorize 1 or 2 verses every day. So I use these little flashcards to remind me. I carry them around with me in my pocket. But I was thinking that you guys, you might want to at least try to memorize something once a week, perhaps. So I was going to tell you my favorite verse from this week is also a great chapter for talking about fear from the coronavirus and such. Psalm 91 is a great passage for fear. And this is the verse I memorized, Psalm 91:14. Because he has set his heart on me, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. So anyway, if you wanted to memorize a verse and needed guidance, that's a great one, Psalm 91:14. But you can pick any verse you want, but I suggest you try memorizing. It helps a lot. Yes?
Years ago, when I came home from work when Paul was younger, there was and I still have the note. He goes, well, this may help you, whatever the word for it, Psalm 91. So.
Yeah, Psalm 91 is a great passage. There's lots of great passages, but the thing I found is if I'm sitting at a stoplight or just doing something at the sink, brushing my teeth, I can think of my memory verses. Sounds like we're on. So anyway, having memory verses to think about during the week is a great thing. Okay, well, this morning we are taking a week off from the book of Job in Sunday school and also from the sermon from Luke. And we're going to spend time this morning considering ministry possibilities at Granada Rehabilitation Center, which is here in Eureka. Now, I mentioned it a few times, and I included it in the pastor's report in the congregational meeting. When my brother and I don't even remember this, but apparently when my brother and I were kids, we used to go with my mom to nursing homes and read and talk to old people. And apparently I enjoyed it, and still in the back of my mind enjoyed it, because when you guys offered me a call last spring to be the pastor here, I was still working at the Grand Canyon Railway, and so I started thinking of things the church could do for ministry, and the first thing that came to my mind was working in care centers. Now, Granada Rehab Center is not technically a nursing home. Nursing homes are generally for people who stay there long periods or the rest of their life. They're actually a rehabilitation center, which means that most of their patients come in for a few weeks or months and then hopefully go home. So that means they are potentially future attendees or members here, but that is not our main goal. That's just a possible blessing that could come from it. But anyway, on the train, I was a tour guide, so to speak, and I would talk about animals. I had stuffed animals that showed all the creatures of the Grand Canyon, about 20 of them. And I would use those to tell people about the animals. And then I had a radio show, and on the radio show for 2 hours every week, I talked 40 minutes about animals, 40 minutes about the Bible, and I read 40 minutes of kids' stories. So talking to people can be a ministry. And this is the first thing I thought we could do. First of all, it's not expensive. In fact, it costs very little. Secondly, it's pretty easy. It doesn't require you to have weeks of training or anything of that nature. And it's nearby. So we don't have to drive 50 miles or send someone thousands of miles. We can do it right here in our town. And it is important for a church to have a ministry so that it's not just insular. We don't want this to be the Christ the Redeemer social club. And all of our light is trapped in these walls. We're supposed to be a light on a hill so that everyone can see us. Well, I purchased a few books on the subject, and I've been reading them. I forgot to bring them over here, so let me grab them out of my pouch. A few books about nursing centers and care centers. So I've read these this week, or well, over the last few weeks. Called to Care is a theology of nursing. It's more for nurses as opposed to what we're doing, but it gave me some good ideas on what it's like in the homes. These were the two best ones. This is Nursing Home Ministry. This is from a Christian ministry. I believe they're in Oklahoma. But anyway, this is a great book on starting nursing home ministries. It's mainly for people in churches to know what to do and how to do it, and how to approach the center and all that sort of thing. And this is just a sort of brief summary of this. So this, if anyone wants to borrow it, has most of the details without all the extras. But anyway, these are books that I used to understand this, and they have websites. There are websites that many churches are doing this Christians ministry to care centers. Now, I already told you a few weeks ago that 83% of the people in our county do not attend good churches. At least 83%. If you throw in borderline churches, it's probably more like 93%. But at any rate, for people who go to Christian churches, there's only 17% of the population, which means we've got a lot of people here who do not go to a good church. That's especially true in a nursing home or a care center, and that's because very few of them are large enough to pay a chaplain or have a chaplain even. So they don't get any spiritual care. And the extent of their spiritual care is watching sermons on TV on Sunday mornings. Or maybe you can watch Christian television. I'm not sure actually that that's any better than watching science fiction. But I suppose it is a little bit better. But the problem in a nursing home or a care center is that people can't go out to a church. And so in a sense, we'd be bringing church to them. That's if we're doing formal services there. A majority of those people will leave though, so we're not going to be running into a lot of people who are completely unable to talk to you. It's not going to be as scary as going into a triage center or something. Well, there are more than 1.5 million people in nursing homes right now and care centers. If you count Canada, it's over 2 million. That's over 5% of our population. So that's quite a lot of people who are in these places. And the percentage is expected to grow rapidly over the next few decades because we are having fewer children now, and previous generations had lots of kids. So all of those baby boomers and such will be getting old, and so a lot of them are going to end up in care centers. Now, this is, if you're looking for work, this is a great place to find work because there will be no shortage of jobs for skilled nurses and caretakers over the next few decades. But it also means that as there's more people in these places, they're going to need more spiritual care. And possibly they're not getting it. About 2/3, oh, by the way, about finding doctors in the area. I spent hours on the phone trying to find a doctor around here. There's just not enough doctors to see all the people. I finally did find one. I just got lucky. I called a place that had hired a new person who had no patients yet. Yeah, sign me up. So I've got a new doctor coming up in a few weeks. But 2/3 of the people in nursing care centers are women. So this is also a way, especially for women, to minister to other ladies. So that's an important point too. And that's because women live longer than men for the most part. They have a few years extra, so they go on longer than men do. If you remember though, the book of Acts, if you want to turn to the book of Acts, we're going to read from the first 7 verses of chapter 6. So Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. This is the first ministry that the early church set up. I mean, aside from preaching, it's the first formal ministry they set up. Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Greeks, because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Then the 12 summoned the multitude of the disciples and said, "It is not desirable that we should leave the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the word." This saying pleased the whole multitude. So they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, and Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. These they set before the apostles, and when they had prayed, they laid hands on them. Then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. So this is Acts chapter 6. Now there's a lot of interesting elements to this passage. First of all, the early church already has a ministry going. They never announced it at first. It just sort of kept going from their old synagogue days. Most of them were Jews. And apparently in their old synagogue days, they made meals for the Jewish women, widows in the church, the older ladies who had no families. But this did not extend to the Gentiles. They kept the old ministry going. The Gentiles, on the other hand, they didn't get the food. So the Greek women who were not Jews were kept out of the free food. Well, some of the Gentiles complained and said that their widows were being neglected by the church ministry. So the 12 apostles called the church together and ordered them to choose 7 good godly men that they could appoint over this ministry so that they could give this ministry to all the widows and not just the Jews. So apparently lots of foreigners were coming in. You remember after the day of Pentecost, lots of foreign people who visited Jerusalem became part of the church. And now they've got foreign women who need care also. One of these 7 men was Stephen. And you know later he would be, in just a few chapters, stoned to death by the Jews and Paul. But they got these Gentile and Jewish Christian members of the church to take over the widows' ministry. And the apostles ordained them as deacons to the work of the ministry. That is our basis for deacons in the church. This is why we have elders and deacons, and not just elders. The deacons are differentiated from elders mainly by doing service ministries, while in general the elders focus on the teaching ministries, just like they're in Acts 6. But notice also that in verse 7, this new and expanded ministry to the Jews and Gentile widows was a factor in the spread of God's word and multiplying the early church. This act of kindness to the older folks led the church to grow, or at least it was a part of that. Now, in this book here about the Christian nurses by Shelley, I want to read you 2 sentences. Ministry in the New Testament and the early church was understood to be the work of every Christian. The Greek term that is translated ministry, diakonia, means service. In fact, the term diakonos, servant, is often used synonymously with doulos, slave. So this is what we call ministry. What the people were doing, serving the widows, was a ministry. It was not just a social work. What's happened in the modern country, we'll get to this soon, but most early ministries to poor people and widows and old people were all church things. The Roman government didn't care about the old people. The Roman government cared about spreading their militaristic system across the world and stealing money from everybody. There were no old folks' homes for Romans. If you were rich and old, you were lucky and you could die in your splendor. If you were poor and old, you just died. But the early church started hospitals. The very first hospitals in the world were started by Christians. And we'll talk about that, how that changed in a few minutes. But in the Bible, we learn from Paul and other writers in the New Testament that there are lots of different spiritual gifts. Some are teaching and leading, others are serving and helping, etc. All of these kinds of gifts are needed in a church. So I'm not the only one you need. I'm the only one you pay, but we need other people to do stuff too. These are all often service ministries. And we're not supposed to be a social club. We're supposed to be helping others. Now in 1 Timothy chapter 5, almost the entire chapter, Paul tells his young pastor Timothy how to work with the widows in the church. And we'll read that later in the sermon, actually, or something like that. But the reason he talks about widows, first of all, he says that younger widows should remarry and create a new family. In other words, we don't want the church ministry filling up with ladies whose husbands died young, because they don't need that. They could go get married again and have a new family. So the purpose was that the family should still be the central unit. The church isn't supposed to be the central unit, neither is the government, which is what's happening. But at any rate, the younger widows should remarry. It's the older widows who need the help. And so they limited the widow ministry to older people and also to orphans. They added orphans to that, because both the older women and the orphans have no way to care for themselves because there's no one there to help pay their bills. And thus, those two groups became widows and orphans, were always in the Old Testament and the New Testament, were central to the ministry of the church. Now you might wonder why Paul only talks about women and not men. That's because in ancient culture, women had no or very few rights, and they had no way to help themselves if they had no family. If you remember the stories of Ruth and Naomi, their husbands died, and they were left penniless without work. And you can't find jobs as a woman unless you're going to be a prostitute, pretty much. So what do? You have to get help somehow. Naomi was too old to remarry, pretty much, but her young daughter Ruth ended up remarrying with Boaz. But that's an example of widows. If you are old and a woman in the Old Testament, you had no way to care for yourself, and thus the church became the center for your care. But that does not mean that there were no men. In general, I would guess that if there were infirm old men, they were helped too if they had no families. But Paul very strongly commands their families to care for them if they've got them. He said widows should not be a burden on the church if they've got families, and if those families will not care for them, let them be accursed. So you don't just get to say, I don't care about grandpa anymore, we're going to let the church take care of him. That's not the way it was supposed to work. So the ministry to orphans is also mentioned. Those kids had no parents, but we don't have any details exactly how that worked. My guess would be that they helped provide them food and perhaps education, and maybe help them when they got old enough to find work. Now, these kinds of ministries were done by the local churches for the first several centuries, the first 400 years after Jesus started the church. But once Christianity became the accepted religion under Constantine in the 5th century, church hospitals were sort of turned into government hospitals. Now that the government is Christian, the government will do it. And what started to happen then is it became formal care, more formal, with professional doctors and professional nurses. And thus, they stopped sort of taking volunteers to take care of the people. They started paying people who were expert at it. And that meant if you were expert in medicine, you got to be a doctor or a nurse. If you were just a Christian wanting to help people, we don't need you. Or you can do some side work. But hospitals became more formal, just as our whole system of professionalization has come. You became an expert craftsman, you got to do all that kind of work, and volunteers weren't needed anymore. Well, that's how hospitals turned into government agencies, was thousands of years ago, or 1,600 years ago. And then people started ignoring all their spiritual needs. If you go to a hospital now, the odds are good there is zero spiritual care. If they've got a chaplain, which is questionable these days with price cuts and all that sort of thing, cutting their payrolls, if you're a Christian, you might be able to ask for a chaplain and he might turn up and talk to you, but not very often. And that's also the case in care centers. If there is a chaplain, he won't get to spend a lot of time with you probably because he'd be full with hundreds of people on his own to work with. So nowadays, many doctors and nurses, all they do is medical care. And that's all they have time for. In order to cut costs, they cut as many people as they can, and so you keep a skeleton crew who can keep the basic minimum of care going, which means they don't have time to help you with any of your emotional or spiritual needs. You're just on your own. And that's why we need this kind of a ministry. Everyone's physical needs are important, but we are not considering the medical end. In fact, we are not supposed to, if we do this sort of thing, you're not supposed to give any medical advice because it might contradict what the doctor said or the nurse said. So you're not supposed to bring them food because you might break their diet, and you're not and you might give them an allergic reaction, and then you're in real trouble. So we're not going to do anything medical. All we're going to do is talk and pray and sing. That's it. We're not in charge of their medical care, and they wouldn't want us there if we thought we were. Now, I want to read you a really interesting piece from this book. I'm going to read you a whole page because it's one of the most interesting stories I've ever read. It's in the chapter about ministering to people with dementia, like Alzheimer's disease. And so in this chapter is this really interesting quotation from a lady. So let me read this to you. My patient neither speaks nor comprehends the spoken word. Sometimes she babbles incoherently for hours on end. She is disoriented about person, place, and time, though she does, however, respond to her own name. I've worked with her for 6 months now, but she still shows no effort to assist in her own care. She must be completely fed, bathed, and clothed by others. She cannot control her bowels or her bladder. Because she has no teeth, all her food must be pureed. Her clothing is usually soiled from incessant drooling. She cannot walk. Her sleep pattern is erratic. Often she awakes in the middle of the night and her screaming awakens others. Most of the time she is friendly and happy, but several times a day she gets quite agitated without any apparent cause. Then she waits for someone to come and comfort her. I asked other doctors and nurses how they would feel about taking care of such a patient. They used words like hopeless, frustrated, depressed, and annoyed. When I said that I enjoyed it and thought they would too, they looked at me in disbelief. Then I passed around the photograph of my patient, my 6-month-old daughter. See, it wasn't an Alzheimer's patient she was talking about. But here's how the quote continued. Why is it so much more difficult to care for a 90-year-old than a 6-month-old with the same identical symptoms? A helpless baby may weigh 15 pounds, and a helpless adult may weigh 150 pounds. But the answer is much deeper than this. The infant represents new life, hope, and almost infinite potential, while the aged patient represents the end of life, with little chance for change and growth because death is near. But wait, what is death? Is it not the greatest potential of all for change and growth? In Christ, death represents the end of the old and the beginning of the new. New life, new hope, and new infinite potential. We should see things from God's perspective. Those who are approaching the end of their lives and are helpless in their old age need and deserve the same attention as those who are beginning their lives in the helplessness of infancy. I thought that was one of the best stories I'd ever read as far as changing your perspective on something. Isn't it strange that well, I shouldn't say we, I've never had a baby, but many people are delighted to help a baby, but are appalled by helping an older person. And a lot of that is strictly mental. It's your prejudgmental idea that the baby deserves care and the older person doesn't. And that's not right. So just to make clear though, I don't know that there are any people with dementia and Alzheimer's in their final stages at Granada. My guess is we would be working mostly with people who are not nearly that incapable. But let me read you some verses that are similar to this. In Matthew chapter 25, the words of Jesus, verses 31 to 40. Matthew 25, 31 to 40. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set his sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to see me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you as a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it for me." The deeds done by the sheep are listed here, and I want you to notice that very few of them, are huge, expensive, lifelong commitments. We're talking about food, drink, housing, clothing. Those are kind of expensive and could be long-term. But what's the final one? Visiting me. When? When I was sick or when I was in prison. So when the brethren of Jesus, as he calls them, all of his children, when they are imprisoned or sick, one of the duties of service that he expects from us is at least to visit. And some of the biggest problems in nursing homes and care centers are that the people are bored and lonely. In this book by Bill Goodrich, Nursing Home Ministry, he said that there are thousands of people in these communities who are hidden behind the walls of care centers. They are often the loneliest, most impoverished people in society. The nurses and the doctors are too overworked to talk to them, so all they do is come in and change the linens and then leave. I'm not trying to criticize them, I'm just saying that's what they have time for. They don't have time to do all of the other stuff that we're talking about. One of the first problems that a person experiences when they go to a care center is culture shock or disorientation. If you're going from being an independent person to suddenly being totally cared for, that's a huge change to your life. They enter a home with a new room. There are strangers all around. There are unfamiliar people wandering in and out. They feel helpless. They can't go out to church. They have to wait for church to come to them. And usually they just have one roommate, and not always is the roommate somebody you want to be friends with or wants to be friends with you. So loneliness is a huge problem there. Now, over the long term, if you stay in a care center for a long time, you can get depressed. Some of them have no family to visit them, or sometimes even worse, they have family who doesn't want to visit them. So either way. If they're not mobile, they have no one but their roommate to talk to. And Mr. Goodrich says that to love and be loved gives a person purpose and hope for tomorrow. But when these are missing, many have no reason for living. Yes?
When our son's in senior in high school, he had to do community service, and one of them was he went to a care home.
And he went to Granada and met a gentleman by the name of Paul. And there was nothing wrong with this gentleman, really. His family did not want to take care of him. So they just basically put him in there to die. I mean, that really affected him. I mean, I think about almost a week, Paul, it just affected him, you know. So, and that's, I mean, when they're 17, 18 years old, I mean, that can either be life-changing or, you know.
Yeah, there is a sense of rejection if you have family that doesn't visit.
But when we went to go see Grandpa, there was this man next to him, really nice man, but there was this lady across the, there's humor there too. There was a lady across the hall, all she would do all day long, she would just call out, and the gentleman in with your dad that got in the wreck, I was sitting there, and I had to go like this, and you had to see the nurse go like, he had to go in the bathroom not to laugh. Because the lady across the hall would be quiet, and the gentleman in the chat was saying, just shut up, you just be quiet. So, it's hard to go, it's hard to go to those places because they're really not places to laugh at, but, it's just.
There's a lot of difficulties in these places, and some of the people, I know who you mean. There was a lady who calls out, yells loudly, help me, I'm hungry,
Yes.
every 30 seconds. So yes, it's difficult for visitors, and it's difficult for the people who live there. I can hardly imagine living there for 24 hours a day with that sort of stuff going on all around. I like quiet and such. Well, obviously people who feel no reason for living, they also don't get better physically. It's hard to heal if you have no hope. Doctors have shown time and time again that prayer and faith help. They won't admit that it's because they're prayer and faith. They'll just say it's because it gives you hope. But the fact is that hope does help you heal better. And so people without hope are going to be there longer. It's a terrible cycle. When people lose the sense of love and belonging that they had, they lose their meaning and purpose in life. Yes?
I work with children. After I got out of the military, I worked in children's homes, orphanages, group homes. And one of the things that we talked about was how those children were nothing more than just warehoused. They didn't care about them. They had nobody to care about them. Family, the government, the people that worked there. They got more compassion from college students working there part-time than they did from the full-time staff, doctors and stuff. It was just like they were warehoused. You stuck them in there and you forgot about them. They were just there until they died or was old enough to get kicked out.
Yeah, orphanages are often very similar to care centers for older people. It's just a warehouse for people to store people in until they hopefully leave. Or some of those places want them to stay because they get government money for keeping them there. So it's a vicious cycle. But all of these people have no way of getting out and getting spiritual or emotional help.
John, in your studies, did you find when it flipped from, we used to be a society where we would take care of our elderly family. When did that flip to now we just push them all into the care homes?
Well, everything started to change probably at the New Deal during the Depression. When the economy completely collapsed, it was the government's duty and job to help people, and thus we formed all sorts of social programs that had never been existing before. I'm not against all the New Deal programs, some of them were very helpful. And then again, it renewed during the Johnson administration, during the Vietnam War era, when the government is responsible to take care of people, and the church and the family no longer are. In fact, the government prefers that family not take care of each other because they want to have more role and hire their friends to take over. So
The Great Society.
the Great Society, yeah, that was the Lyndon Johnson term, I think. Yeah, so there are a number of factors in this, and all of them boil down to Satan. Satan loves it when he can take control of every part of your life. You're already his slave in many ways. You're a devotion to sin. But if you can also get families not to care for each other and no one else to care for you, you've got nothing and you die in your poverty and shame and loneliness. That's the ideal world for the devil. Just read a book by C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength. How the devil not only, in Paralandra, the second book of the C.S. Lewis space trilogy, he talks about the fall of man, Adam and Eve. But it's on Venus with a new lady and a new man. And the devil's there tempting him, and the good godly man is trying to tell Eve, no, don't listen to him. Well, so that's about individual sin. The third book is about institutional sin. How does the devil use governments and corporations? So this is true not only of a socialist government, but of a capitalist government as well. Either way, the devil can take advantage and bring horrors to the world. And Nazi Germany was just one example of what you can get when everybody agrees with the government. Whether it had been socialist, fascist, capitalist, it doesn't matter. All of them turn bad because Satan runs them. So at any rate, what we have now is a satanic system that wants people to die in complete shame and guilt. And what we're trying to do is bring light to that wicked world and drive out those devils. That's one of the points of our ministry. Jesus' ministry and healing was not just to give that person comfort, it was to show that he was knocking out the kingdom of Satan. And supposedly the the devil will never prevail against the church. But there are times when it sure looks like he is. Well, also, let me read now verse James 1:27, another sample of this idea. James 1:27. This is a lot like some of the Old Testament prophets. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So here we have another passage telling us to do what? Take over their lives? Visit. It seems like such a little thing. And we've been talking about Job now for a couple of months. And if you remember in Job, the best thing, the only one really good thing that Job's friends did was visit. They showed up. That was more than almost anybody else did, even more than his wife. Of course, they really screwed up later when the whole visit turned into an argument. But the fact that they showed up was good. They came from afar and they sat there with their friend. And we're not planning to go very far, only a couple of miles, but we can visit some strangers and they might become friends. We are not nurses. We won't do any medical. We're not giving them aspirin. We're not giving them cookies. Nothing. In fact, even touching in this time of the coronavirus, I would suggest that they may even tell us not to come right now because they'd be afraid of getting it there. But in the future, if we were to work there, you only touch if asked. Don't be a touchy-feely person because it might make them uncomfortable or even transfer some bacteria or virus to them. So at any rate, what we're talking about is bringing emotional and spiritual relief to a person. You see, we are, as humans, we are body, soul, and spirit, or body and soul, whichever way you go, bipartite or tripartite, doesn't matter. But you can't separate those things. Now, God can separate them because when we die, our body is dead and in the ground, and our spirit or soul goes to heaven. But we will rejoin our bodies, so we're meant to be together. That means that the hospitals are taking care of the body. They are not taking care of the soul or spirit. So what we want to do is try to help the soul of those people. And so by helping them emotionally, that helps them spiritually. Because if you have hope and friends, you don't feel so bad and your body will recover quicker as well. We want people to have good human relationships, and that will in turn hopefully bring a better relationship with God. It's hard to have a vertical relationship with God if you have no horizontal relationship with other people. This is why people join a church and are supposed to become members, because we can then help each other officially, and that helps us spiritually as well. Now, there are two different aspects to the proposal I'm making for our church's ministry at the Granada Rehabilitation Center. One aspect is the individual visitation of people. That's where you would go alone or with your family members to visit people one at a time on your own. That's whenever you want. So it doesn't have to be scheduled necessarily, although you could schedule it with the activities director. I can get you her number once we get things started. But the other is the more formal kind of work, if we were to have the worship service or a group meeting there at the home. Now, there's advantages to both kinds, and I'm hoping we will try both. But the alone or individual ministry is something you might be more afraid of. Because some people like to go in groups because they're a little nervous about being alone. I'm single. I'm used to doing things alone. I go to the movies on my own. I eat on my own. So I'm not worried about this. I can do that. But some of you, if you want to go in groups, that's fine. But my personal plan for the near future is to go to Granada at least once a week and spend a couple hours to visit a few or several people, depending on how long they want to chat. I will ask the activities director for some ideas on which rooms to visit. I'll ask her which people maybe don't have any people who visit them. No one comes, no family. Or who might be the loneliest. Or who might be asking for attention. And then go work with those people first. Because the people who know they have a need are the most receptive to getting that need filled. But there are also, of course, some people who won't want to talk to us for whatever reason. But we just want to talk to those who wish to talk. My plan is to introduce myself and to ask the man or lady if she'd like to talk, or I could read or tell a story to them. One option would be always to have a Bible and read a Bible story, or if they have a favorite book in the Bible, read a piece of that to them. I will also take funny or cheerful short books like the Dr. Seuss book, You Only Get Old Once. Or I have a book about elephants, how aging is great for elephants, and it has big pictures. And So it's almost like reading to kids, but it's fun or cheery. And I might also take a stuffed animal representing a local bird or animal. If they like animals, I could tell them about this creature that lives here in their area. So spending 10 to 30 minutes with them, depending on how long they wanted to chat. And if they get tired of it, I'll thank them and leave, and probably give them my business card, offer or ask if they'd like me to come back in a couple of weeks, see if that's something they want. Also, I would offer to pray with them briefly if they wanted it, and if they didn't, I wouldn't. So the point is, we're not trying to convert people. That is not our main purpose. Our main purpose is to give them love and care and compassion and someone to talk to. Other things may come of that. It's what you call friendship evangelism. It's not what we used to do at Master's College. We used to go down to UCLA and meet people cold on the street. We call it cold turkey, and try to give them the gospel. And we were so excited because it seemed so successful. They gave us no New Testaments to give to people who wanted them. And we had people coming up to us asking for New Testaments. We're handing them out. We ran out. We were going back to the car to get more New Testaments out of the trunk. And as we walked through the alley to the parking lot, we saw all these guys tearing the pages out, rolling tobacco and marijuana in them and smoking them. So the only reason they wanted our Bibles was for the onion skin paper to make cigarettes out of. So that was a little depressing end to that ministry. But anyway, there's other things that could be done. People, by the way, you could also go in pairs. You don't have to go alone. In general, that would be one person doing most of the talking and one person just sitting, nodding and listening and learning and praying for the whole situation, praying for the person that you're talking to. And that's one way that the person who's listening can learn and gain confidence to see how easy it is to talk to people. Most people are capable of talking. I don't know anyone here who is incapable of talking. So anyway, that's a ministry, believe it or not. I wouldn't suggest, though, more than 2 people, because that would seem like a crowd and sort of ganging up on the person. So often they love, in fact, to talk to children. Older folks have an affinity for children. So if you were to take a kid with you, they'd probably enjoy that too.
Do they have any restrictions on that? Sometimes
I have to consult with the activities director.
Like age restrictions.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if there's age restrictions, but it's possible. I'll ask. But the other thing I'm going to ask about is also about bringing an animal, a live animal, like my little bird. I would get a little small cage that she would just be in for me to carry around and not take the bird out. But people love to see animals. So I have to ask, some places have an idea that all animals are unsanitary, spread germs. So I'll have to ask, but some places allow it. Some of them even adopt pet animals for the building and take care of them. Yes?
Even if you bring on an individual, you can find out what that person kind of music they like to listen to. Then you can download that, you can download it on the phone or whatever, because they said that with elderly people, it's like with dementia, that if you play music, it's like they just light up.
Yeah.
It's something I guess it's something that they remember more than others.
We will talk about music here in a few moments,
Sorry.
but it is a great idea. But another thing you could do is you can give people something that really doesn't cost much. You could give them a pretty card, even a used card, and with pretty pictures on it, or just to say you were happy to see them. Or people who have artistic ability, you could draw a little picture and set it on their dresser. Or do calligraphy, maybe a Bible verse in calligraphy to give to them. So there's all sorts of things you can do that don't cost much money. Yeah?
Granada has an animal program there.
Oh.
I've been over there visiting your grandpa. They had a woman walking through all the rooms with a dog.
Oh, service
There was
dog, great.
another lady that had a cat who was walking around.
Okay, then that would mean that Granada already accepts animals. So we probably just have to clear up with the activities director. And I would generally say, unless it's an approved animal, that you don't let people pet it. For instance, I'm not going to let them touch my bird. If you were to take a lizard or a turtle in a little bowl, they do have diseases. They can have salmonella, for instance. So you don't want people touching your little turtle. It's just something to bring some joy into their lives because they're sitting in a white room with white walls, with white curtains. And if they've got a window, that's nice. But what do you see? The parking lot. So they've really got nothing to do except watch TV a lot of times. And so that's what we're trying to get away from. Let's see. Another thing I was going to ask the activities director is whether they have any patients who speak a lot of Spanish, or if that's their main language. Because we have a lot of people here who speak Spanish. I don't know any Spanish except for the words I get called, like loco and things. But aside from that, I don't know any Spanish. But that would be particularly helpful, especially if they've got no one in their room to speak Spanish to, you know. So these are all sorts of ideas we can have. Now we'll talk about the formal service proposal. That's all individual. You are all free to go anytime you want once we arrange this with the activities director. By any time you want, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure they have hours, probably between 9 and 4. Because a lot of these folks go to sleep early and get up late. So there's no reason going in the middle of the night. They probably won't let you in. But at any rate, you could go on a day you were off and do this anytime. But the formal idea is a little more complicated, but it is important. And the reason is that a lot of these people can't go to church. Christians are not. They just can't. They're physically unable. Or even if they're able to walk, they don't have a car or a driver's license. And the van there will only take them places for official doctor visits. They don't just get to drive them all over the place to go shopping or to church. But we could bring church to them. The question will obviously be, gradually we'll decide how often to do it. The activities director seemed very supportive of the idea of having a church service there. She proposed Saturday afternoon. That's a possibility. On the other hand, if we wanted to, if it became a big thing, we could do it Sunday afternoons. But whether it's every month or every 2 weeks or every week, that's a whole other question. But these are the things that go into having a formal service. And we don't have to decide everything now. For example, we don't have to decide if we're going to do a communion service. We don't have to do that. We'll take communion to people we know to be Christians and who are members and etc. We'll worry about that later. So we're not worried about that right now. What we want to do is gather some people in a large space, sing, read scripture, pray, and have a 10 to 15 minute sermon or lesson. Most of them can't last more than that. I remember seeing folks falling asleep here after 15 minutes. So we won't put that on them. But music is very important because it is strange how I and other older people remember music far better than we remember anything else. I mean, how many stupid commercials from the 70s do you remember? I remember lots of them. It's just stuck in my brain. It's like riding the Disneyland It's a Small World. Once you hear the song, you never get it out of your mind and you despise it. But it's the same. Once you hear music, you don't forget it easily. And so a lot of these people, if they went to church, they know hymns. And so hearing or singing a hymn brings back good memories. And I would call those, in a way, spiritual memories. So I don't want to lessen the idea of music. It is very important. They don't have a lot of group activities at these homes because it's just too much work for the nurses to wheelchair them all out to one area and then wheelchair them all back. The idea is, according to these books, if you're going to hold a worship service, you need 4 to 8 people to be working with it. I would guess for a small group like us, 4 would be enough. What you need is a team leader or coordinator. It wouldn't necessarily be me. Somebody to make the arrangements of the date and who's coming and all of that. Secondly, you need a teacher. That would probably usually be me. Third, you need a music director or someone doing music. And fourth, you need helper or helpers. Now, the job of the helpers is actually very important because there probably won't be enough nurses to wheel everybody out who wants to come. So the helpers can go with the nurses put the patient in the chair, and then the helper can drive them to the... We can't put them in the chair, though. That's, if they fall, then we're in trouble. So we let the nurse put them in the chair, and then we wheel them to the service. So these are sort of things you have to think about. Now, the music is the trickiest part also. The reason is, I'm not sure if they have a piano. I think they might. But if they didn't, we would have to either have a piano or a synthesizer or something, or we could use pre-recorded music or a guitar. And we'd want there to be more than one musical person because we can't always rely on the same person to be available whenever we do this. But that's probably the trickiest part. If necessary, we might have to get a little portable sound system. We had a guy on the train, a lot of our entertainers on the train had a neck-held amplifier or speaker just hang down on their chest. And so everybody could hear them in the train car. Might do something like that. We have speakers, little speakers out. But these are all details. They're not that important, but I just want to show you some of the problems we could run into. Now, if you think you aren't capable of doing this sort of thing, think again. The odds are good that you're capable of talking. You remember Moses trying to make excuses why he couldn't go to Egypt? I don't talk so good. God's like, well, who made your mouth? You're talking back to me quite well. No. He's like, get Aaron, he talks good. Well, it doesn't require talking good. It's not like you're going to have to do rocket science when you're talking to them. The goal is to see if they want to talk to you and you can talk to them. And it's not always going to be spiritual things. Sometimes it's going to be about their families or their pets or things of that nature. So we're just going to have an ear. And remember that your ears are sometimes more important than your mouth. I forget who said it, but somebody said, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Why don't we use them in that proportion? Yeah. So listening is important. Another thing to think about, in the survey of nurses, there was a big survey of nurses, Christian nurses, done in this book. They were asked, what is the most important thing for a person who wants to care at a care center or go visit a care center? And you can think of all sorts of ideas. You might think that competence is the most important thing. Nope. 80% of the nurses said compassion is the most important feature of someone going. So it doesn't matter if you do everything right. What matters is that you care and that they know you care. And usually they can tell if you care or if you're just putting on a show. So we're not going there to proselytize. We're not going there like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses in our black suits knocking on the door. That's not the way it is. And by the way, I was just thinking and laughed to myself pretty heartily about this. Is it the 4 spiritual laws? Is that the form of evangelism where you go up to say, and you say, if you die today, where will you go? That's not something to say at a care center. There's a funny story in here where the head nurse had to fire a younger nurse because every time they would wheel somebody into the operating room, this young nurse would say, if you die in this surgery, will you go to heaven or hell? And the people would suddenly get scared and stop the surgery. She had to fire the lady because, you don't tell people who are on the operating table, are you going to die now? That's not encouraging them. So don't do that. So I wouldn't recommend that form of evangelism. Let's not start with where will you go when you die. Let's try to talk to them more kindly. Let's see. So also, if you are really scared and you don't want to go, you could help in another way. That is babysitting. Because it's possible that there are people who would like to participate who can't because they've got kids running around. If we could have babysitters here or activities being done or at somebody's house, it wouldn't matter, but then the parents could come and do ministry. So that's another way of helping if we had a sort of a nursery or babysitting ministry. Well, up on this board here, I have what this author says are the 5 biggest needs in the care centers. The 5 biggest needs are caring friendships. A lot of these people no longer have any friends and would love the opportunity to have one. And it is possible that if you go and visit a person and they want you to come back, you could go back there regularly. It's not like you have to meet a different person every time you go. We're just going to help as many people as we can that God puts in our path. Secondly, faith or testimonies. When you are personally able to share with what God has done for you. I'm not talking about necessarily your salvation, but just how you get up in the morning and feel better. How you feel when something goes wrong. You're scared about the coronavirus. A testimony of someone who's already dealt with this thing can help them, give them confidence. Thirdly, hope. Now, I don't just mean physical hope. That's for the doctors and nurses to give them. We can't promise them that God's going to heal them. In fact, there's a good chance He won't. But we can give them eternal hope. If they have hope in their spiritual life, that there's a God, that there's the Son of God, Jesus, who loves them and wants them to become believers and be with Him in heaven, that's hope. That's real hope. Fourthly, peace. I mean internal peace, contentment, an ability to face the fear that they're already having. You realize that people in care homes are probably more afraid than we are, and rightly so, because they have fewer days ahead than they have behind, and they know they're going to die soon, or probably pretty soon. So they're already thinking about their mortality and they're afraid of it. We, as we'll discuss in the sermon, we have a confidence that we don't need to be afraid. 2 Timothy 1:7, but I've not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love. So these are the sort of things that these people could use, is hope and peace. And finally, purpose. One of the worst things for a person in a care center is the loss of purpose. When you're younger, you've got a job, you've got a family, you have things to do every day, you've got a schedule. When you're there, the only schedule is when the nurse comes out and stabs you with a needle. I mean, that's not a real happy schedule. So what is your purpose? You're just like a porcupine getting poked every day. It gives them a purpose to know that they have other people who care about them and who care enough to come and talk to them. So I think these are the most important needs that these people have, and these are things we could give them with very little effort. I mean, we're not talking about a part-time job here. We're just talking about visiting for an hour or two a week. So that's my proposal. We can talk in future weeks about how to do this. My guess is that if we started doing these things, it would be good to have a monthly meeting, maybe in one of our third services or at a men's breakfast or a women's breakfast, where we just discussed what we learned, who we talked to, what we could have done better, ideas for the future, ideas, we don't want to do that anymore, that didn't work. Where we learn and grow. This is a growing process. We're not going to get it right the first time. I plan to go chat with people, whether we do anything formal or not, but the activities director was hopeful that we would start some kind of a service because many people have requested it, even if we only did it once a month or twice a month. Now, we could do it after our potluck meal instead of the third service, or we could do it on a Saturday. Weekdays are pretty tough for most people, although we might be able to get away with 3 people. I mean, it's even possible that I could do a worship service alone, but there wouldn't be any music unless I played it on a tape recorder or a CD player. And I think music is more important than that. It can be done, but it wouldn't be the best. So we'll wrinkle out the wrinkles later. We'll iron out the wrinkles later. So we've got 12 minutes left. We have time for some discussion and or questions.
We had spoke about your number 2 on there, the faith testimonies. And I think that's also important amongst us as believers. Part of the church is to share the testimony with one another, which we do briefly on our third services. But I think that it's important for us to be
Ready to share our testimony.
Yeah, absolutely, and not just, I'm going to Granada to do this, but willing to share it here amongst other believers, because there's people in the church that are struggling through something, and your testimony helps for them.
That's right. The point here, for those of you who are just listening on the radio or on TV, is that testimonies are important even for the church. And we're talking about doing this in the third service, where someone could give a 5-minute testimony, not necessarily of your salvation, but how God's helping you currently. Because those are a blessing to all of us, as well as to people at Granada. And in fact, that would be a great way of practicing, so to speak, what you're going to say. If you say it here with your friends, then you can say it later with strangers. So we should always have a testimony ready to talk to people about why Jesus is important to us. Yes.
And it's also just that they allow you to just hold their hand. And if you just sit there quietly with them. For me personally, I need that. Like, you want to go to the dentist and I have a tooth pulled. As soon as the nurse one time took my hand, it's like the anxiety totally went out of me. And you can just do that. Even if you just went in and held their hand for 10 minutes and they don't really want to talk. Maybe especially like if a person that, has trouble speaking and you just hold their hand and read to them. You don't necessarily have to sit there and chatter.
That's true.
It's just that physical contact is very calming to people.
Physical contact is very calming. At the moment, we have to be careful with it. Well, right, some people don't like it, but we have to be careful because of the virus right now. Hopefully in the future that won't be as big of an issue. And just be careful to wash your hands all the time so you're not spreading your germs. But it is also true there are a lot of people in care centers who are debilitated in only their speech. For example, a lot of stroke victims lose their power of speech, at least to a degree. And you might think that because they can't talk, they're not too bright and you shouldn't talk to them, but that's not the case. In fact, they say that most stroke victims and even people in comas can often hear and understand you completely for years, even though they can't reply. So it doesn't mean that you're not helping a person just because they're not responding. It is possible that you can help people who are unresponsive just by reading. Give them a little attention. Other questions or comments? Okay. Dave, would you close us in prayer?
Gracious Lord, we thank you for this beautiful day that you granted us, for this opportunity to gather together in your name, to offer up worship to you, to encourage one another. We thank you for your kindness and your mercies. May you be with us throughout this day and guide us. We ask in Jesus' name.
So we've got about 30 minutes before we start our next worship service. We'll do some time of prayer in the back there. Oh, if anyone wants to borrow either of these two books, I'm going to keep the blue one, but you guys can look at these if you want. This little summary here.
You know, since Ricky learned piano, it's my desire to learn without but I just didn't know how.
Oh, we'll see if we can figure it out. Okay, oh. They're not, yeah.
I don't even
What?
start.
No visitors right now?
No.
Okay, well, I'm guessing it's going to take us a month or two to get this going anyway, so.